Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you are in for a real treat today because I am in for a real treat today. I have with me Alison Taylor, one of my favorite people in, I would say compliance, but that doesn't begin to describe her remit and what she talks about and works in now. So, Alison, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Tom, and very nice to see you.
Alison, you have one of the most unique professional backgrounds of anyone in our field. So I was wondering if you remind our audience a little bit about your professional background and your current role.
Sure. So we probably shouldn't dive too far back, but I spent my 20s doing editing jobs, consulting jobs. I worked in political risk. Then I worked for 12 years in corporate investigation. So that is where I have the most overlap with the compliance and ethics communities. I worked for a company called Control Risks, first as head of investigations, Middle East and Africa, and then same role for the Americas. Lots of FCPA due diligence, some investigation, some background checks, some network analysis, much of this taking place when FCPA enforcement really ramped up. Then in 2015, I moved to sustainability, or what is sometimes now called ESG. So I went to work for a well-known nonprofit to do consulting for large multinationals on topics like climate change, human rights, sustainability, corporate responsibility. And then since the end of 2019, I've been at NYU, first running a think tank called Ethical Systems, and now I'm a full-time member of the faculty. And as you said, I've just written a book called Higher Ground. That's what I do with my time these days, apart from a number of advisory roles still with companies.
So let me turn to higher ground. Why did you write this book?
It's partly because of that story I've just told you. So I spent a lot of time working with ethics and compliance officers and general counsels and their company lawyers and bankers to look at what companies were doing that was illegal and risky. And then I moved to as well of sustainability and ESG. And it was very striking to me that there was a very different vision of what it took to be a good business or an ethical business. Very different ideas, very different terminology, very different jargon, very different kind of philosophical notions of the role of business in society. And I became fascinated by that disconnect. I became fascinated by why, if we have these two disciplines that both are concerned with questions of the role of business in society and what it takes to be a good business, why they didn't seem to talk to each other and why the ideas didn't seem to translate. So that raised a lot of other questions for me about the business ethics landscape and what's changing and what isn't, what companies get right and wrong. And what I really tried to do is provide a kind of path through all that very confusing stuff and provide clarity for somebody that maybe doesn't have the kind of background that you and I have, is not deep in the ethics and compliance space, and is also maybe not deep in the sustainability space, but is wrestling with these questions, is in senior leadership and wondering how to move forward in this chaotic time we find ourselves in.
I'm always fascinated with the writing process. So could you tell us a little bit about your writing process? Are you a morning writer, an evening writer, catch as catch can writer, a sit down and do it all at once writer? How did you write this book?
Oh, what a good question. I started off thinking of myself as not a morning person. And so for the first little bit, I was writing the book. I would try to get my calls and other work done in the morning and then feel I could focus for the rest of the day. I discovered, though, after a little while, that doesn't work. So my recommendation for anyone listening that wants to write is you need to do it first thing when you have the brain space. And then the other thing I discovered during this process is that you can really only do 3 or 4 hours, maybe 4 hours maximum of good writing a day. So you can do other stuff on the book in your day. You can do research, you can do interviews, you can read. But I think I found that my productive writing time beyond about 3 hours, I just was losing. And then the other thing I really found, I don't know if you found the same thing, just an emotional roller coaster. So you feel very happy with something at midday. And then you look at it again at 6 p.m. and you're like, oh, I just wasted the whole day. I got to start again tomorrow. So it's definitely a tough process. If anyone listening wants to talk about writing a book, they can call me and I'll kick around the idea and see if it's a good idea or not.
So how long would you say it took really from when you fully committed to writing the book to you turned in your manuscript?
It took about 2 years or a little bit more. I was also had a full-time job and was teaching as an adjunct on the side. So it was certainly not the only thing I was doing. That said, there was a pandemic, so I was traveling a lot less than I used to and had a bit more time to walk in the woods about this stuff. But yeah, it took a long time. It took a lot of rewrites, took a lot of restructures, took a lot of things.
So I'd like to maybe take a little bit of a dive into the book. And I really wanted to start with literally how you started the book, which was about the new CEO at Starbucks, whose name I won't even try to pronounce. But he took over at a time where there seemed to be a complete disconnection between the corporate office and the executives, even at as high as the CEO chair, and with literally what I'd call the floor employees or the baristas at every Starbucks that certainly I go to, in terms of their desire to band together to see better conditions of work. Some people call that unionization, and it drove a consensus in a way that certainly Starbucks was not expecting. But could you maybe walk us through that and why you chose that story to open the book?
Yes, I chose the story of Starbucks and the pressure it's had over labor rights, which, as listeners will know, has had an enormous amount of media reporting, an enormous amount of negative. It's a very interesting example because there's been negative media attention. Students at Cornell kicked Starbucks off campus and said they were going to find a new, more ethical coffee vendor. Starbucks investors were pressuring it to do something about this. Starbucks employees, and you've spoken about how typically you do see a disconnect between the white collar corporate office employees and then the shop floor or frontline employees. They even banded together to challenge senior leadership about this. So there was a lot of pressure on this issue. The reason that I think it's so fascinating is that by any credible measure, so any ratings, rankings that you can think of, Starbucks is a leader on sustainability, and it's even a leader on labor rights. If you look at its DEI, its employee benefits, its worker treatment, Just Capital does a very credible survey, it's first or second in its sector. So there's this amazing, and then being anti-union is not unusual in corporate America. So it's an amazing illustration of how you can be an outperformer. You can tick the boxes on ESG and sustainability. You can do stuff that's better than your competitors, and it won't necessarily protect you reputationally. It won't necessarily protect you in terms of stakeholder perception. And so I found this an interesting counterintuitive example because we like to tell in the ethics and compliance and responsibility space, we like to tell company leaders a story where if you do a good job on this stuff, you'll have more trust and you'll have a better reputation and people will like you and reward you for these efforts. And with Starbucks, I think that the way that Starbucks has treated the unionization problem is certainly a strategic error. But the idea that a bunch of students would kick Starbucks off campus so they could maybe have a firm like Dunkin' Donuts is so fascinating because I can tell you for sure, Dunkin' Donuts does not have such good labor rights and does not have such good coffee sourcing and does not have such good other things. So it's such an interesting example of how you can get treated really differently for the same conduct and how reputational risk, social media pressure, public perceptions don't necessarily line up with who's a good or bad biz. Sometimes they do. But the way I put it in the book is that we talk as if reputational risk is a linear accountability mechanism, and it's actually more of a fun mirror.
And that's why I appreciated that story of Starbucks because I believed in all of those things that you articulated about their sustainability, about their worker rights, about the fact that people at 21 hours got health care. They
Exactly.
were in many ways seen as a very good company to work for younger people or people even coming into the workplace for the first time. But that really leads to the first chapter. And that I wanted to ask you about that Starbucks story because it's entitled, How Does a Company Rebuild Stakeholder Trust or Build? And I even parenthetically thought, how could it rebuild stakeholder trust if we accept that there's more than simply a shareholder, something as expansive as the Business Roundtable's statement on the purpose of a corporation or some other formulation? But how does a company do that in 2024?
I think the way that we have seen this play out is that now we're having a very polarized conversation. There is a chorus of people on the Republican side of the House saying that all this sustainability stuff is just woke nonsense. It's still socialism. We need to go back to Milton Friedman. We need to focus on shareholder value. We need to stop all this nonsense. And then on the left, though, you've got this idea that if any of your stakeholders cares about this thing, you need to be doing something about it. You need to be solving climate change, inequality, human rights challenges, immigration, reproductive rights. You need to be out there with a message to every single one of your stakeholders. And I think that's unachievable. So I feel that companies are really trapped between these two unachievable visions. A lot of the rhetoric about stakeholders and stakeholder capitalism, I think, has encourage CEOs to overpromise, encourage CEOs to take on challenges they can't actually solve. And I think part of the problem, part of the need now to build more trust is about being more honest and focused and restrained about the kind of claims you make that your business can and can't solve. And then maybe focusing on a few issues that are business relevant and treating your employees with dignity and respect, understanding you can't control your reputation anymore. But I think there's been a big problem with overpromising and a big problem with treating these topics as they are and not matching your talk with your walk.
So how would you counsel a company to think about setting its social and environmental priorities? Is it just a few and try to do them very well or some other formulation?
Yeah, so chapter 4 of my book's all about this. The typical way that companies set environmental and social priorities is called a materiality assessment. So materiality is just another word for relevance. But if you look at a company, and there are many of these materiality assessments published online, so you can Google them, what you typically see on these materiality maps is maybe 30 issues. You tend to see a lot of issues and get a sort of laundry list of companies' achievements and initiatives and smiling, happy children pictures and look at all the wonderful things we're doing. And there's a real reluctance to focus. There's a real reluctance to say, we're not going to deal with this thing. We're not going to deal with this problem. We're not going to listen to this particular stakeholder pressure for obvious reasons. But part of, I think, what you need to do is figure out which issues are really strategically important to your business and to your stakeholders and focus. So focus on 1 to 3 issues rather than trying to tick the box on 30 or 40.
So I've been in the compliance field for a long time. As I'm a lawyer by professional training, so rules and regulations are very important to me, policies and procedures. But you ask us to think about something broader than that. And how can we rethink an ethical culture, even moving to an ethical business?
I think anyone in compliance will know, right? That all the compliance people I talk to, yes, you can have policies and procedures and paperwork and checks and balances and rules. If the leadership is not listening to you as a compliance person, you're going to find it very hard to hold unethical leaders accountable, especially if you report into them. And then also, rules don't work in a vacuum. So if you've got a set of rules, but the rewards, the promotion criteria, the incentives, the culture, the signal from leadership aren't aligned with those rules, then what you'll get is a disconnect. So the two things I run into all the time in the classroom and in my professional life are: one, the company says on the wall it has a certain set of values and then behaves completely differently. Or secondly, there's one set of rules for the people at the top and another set of rules for everybody else. And human beings are very good at picking up on those implicit signals, very good at picking up on those mixed messages. And so this speaks to the fact that the ethics and compliance teams can't work in silos and can't work in a vacuum. If you're just creating rules and processes in a vacuum and you're not thinking about how you align with the wider business, your policies and procedures are not going to succeed. I don't think this is news to anybody listening, but it has implications for the future of the function and implications also for the future of how we treat these wider corporate responsibility topics, especially as questions of ESG are now becoming regulated.
You used a term that I particularly appreciated called mid century. And I appreciate that one because I'm using it. But even more importantly, it's a word I was never able to use in my lifetime. Now I can use it. And somewhat scarily, I can use it. But we are coming to mid century. And how do we? I'm fascinated with the number of generations in the workplace. Literally, people from my daughter to me, and lots of others below her and above me. And so I really want to explore with you, how does leadership begin to think about engaging those 5 generations of employees?
What a good question. I think you can see and you can feel, and we're all experiencing that Gen boomers have different values from Gen X, but who have really different values from millennials, who have really different values from Gen Z. So the younger you are, the more likely you're going to be concerned with questions of having real impact in your career, the more concerned you're going to be with questions of climate change and diversity, the less respect you're likely to have for senior leaders. Something I hear all the time from executives today is, yeah, the 25-year-old intern stood up in the town hall meeting and challenged me about not having a diverse enough board. And far more willingness, I think, to challenge authority, a real concern with authenticity. Obviously, young people very sophisticated on social media, very much more willing to leak damaging internal information into the public domain to try and hold employers accountable. And I think the kind of wider shift as we don't trust the political process and we'll try and pressure our employer, pressure private sector companies, pressure the brand to take action on these things is not the way that you and I were brought up and not the way we thought about work, not the way we thought about jobs and not the way we thought about the role of corporations. So I think there's this kind of big picture challenge or debate about the role of business in society playing out. And very often the way that's playing out is a lot of intergenerational internal tensions in the office. So big tensions between left and right. We know that America's very polarized, and then big tensions across generations as well. And that's even before we get into the effect of COVID and the shift to remote work. And the fact that if you're under about 26, you don't remember what office culture was like before the pandemic. So we're really recreating these issues. And I think people forget that young people actually don't remember what we all remember it used to be like. You hear young people saying, oh, I couldn't work in an office 5 days a week. And they say, like, oh, I couldn't kick a puppy. And I'm just like, I did that for decades. It's easy enough, I think, for people our age to think they just need to, listen and learn. But I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think there are really big differences in the way young people see the world.
Part of that I see as a great opportunity because it's an opportunity to explore different methods, different ways to work, different ways to think about the delivery of a product or service. Is that something you saw in your research or interviews for this book?
Absolutely. So this really plays out in questions of sustainability because very often it's young employees that are more informed and more passionate about these issues. And we tend to treat change initiatives as being very top down, but very often it's the resistance that's at the top and the push for change that's coming from the bottom. I think it also shows up in the ethics and compliance world. So what we need, arguably, or I would argue, is less roles and more employees willing to use principles and judgment and speak up and raise concerns. We need more open debate. And so for that, we need different mechanisms to think about speaking up and employee voice and how to make decisions and think about our ethical commitment.
Why do you believe that purpose starts with impact?
I don't think it's a coincidence that the people most enthusiastic about purpose are branding consultants. So, really, what I'm saying here is we can't treat purpose as PR. We need to think about the role of our business in society. We need to acknowledge that every business has both positive and negative impacts. And we need to place the impact of the business on human beings at the center of ethics commitments, I think.
So let me ask, what's next for Allison?
God, what a good question. I'm talking about my book. I'm going on a lot of podcasts, writing a lot of articles. I'll be touring Europe in May and June, giving a lot of kind of talks there, but going to be very exciting. And then in July, I guess I'm going to recover and figure out if I'm going to attempt to write another book or just go back to doing a lot more advisory work or just have a break and teach for a bit. But I think it's been a few years of very hard work. And now what I would really like to do is have a lot of conversations, share ideas, see if we can kick around these ideas. I love people telling me I'm wrong. I love people getting in touch to tell me what they liked and didn't like about the book. So hoping that we can kick off a new conversation.
I hope that I can be a part of that conversation and we can continue this conversation. Allison, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted more information on you or perhaps connect with you and find out more about the book, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Yeah, you can go on my website. It's alisontaylor.co. That's one L in the Alison. So Alison, Taylor.co. I'm also very easy to find on LinkedIn. Just look me up, Alison Taylor, NYU. Again, one L in the Allison. You'll see me. I have a wonderful community on LinkedIn, and I would love to have more people join the conversation there.
Well, Allison, I'm absolutely thrilled you wrote this book. You're one of the leading thought leaders in our space and have been so for a long time. So when this book came out, I was particularly thrilled for you for the concepts and topics. And now that you really want to have a conversation about all of these. So I hope we can continue that. And I look forward to seeing if I can visit with you again.
Amazing. I hope so too. And thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and have a good weekend.